I used to think loneliness was a dramatic word, the kind people said when they wanted attention. In my mind, I was simply busy. That's what I told myself the winter after my 68th birthday, when the sun went down early and my house felt bigger than it had any right to. Uh, I had a routine: coffee before the news, a slow walk to the mailbox, a few chores, then whatever errands I could justify so the day had edges. I kept the television on, not because I cared what was playing, but because silence made the rooms feel unfinished. The odd part was how competent I looked from the outside. I paid the bills, kept the driveway clear, kept my appointments. I answered texts with a thumbs up and told people I was doing okay. I believed then that if you didn't fall apart, you weren't lonely. You were handling it. I understand now that you can handle your days and still be missing your life. I even kept the little things running: the trash out on Thursdays, the yard trimmed, the car washed. If someone had asked, I could have listed tasks and called that a life, and nobody would have argued. One Tuesday afternoon, I drove to the grocery store in a light snow that had started as pretty and turned into something sharp. I stood in front of the soup aisle, staring at labels like they were instructions I couldn't quite read. A woman beside me reached for the same brand my wife used to buy, and for a second my mouth opened as if I was going to say, "That one's good." I didn't. I smiled in that polite way people do and moved my cart an inch to the left like that was a conversation. At checkout, the young cashier asked how my day was going. "Fine," I said, quick and clean. I heard myself and felt something dull in my chest. Not sadness exactly, more like a door closing. Driving home, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd told the truth in answer to a simple question. I believed then that keeping things light was kindness, that not needing anyone was a form of strength. I understand now it was a kind of disappearing I'd trained myself to do. That night I ate soup straight from the pot, standing at the counter, so I wouldn't have to see the empty table. I rinsed the spoon, wiped the stove, turned off the lights room by room, and it occurred to me that I could go an entire day without being touched or truly seen. I went to bed early, not tired, just out of ideas. In the dark, I listened to the refrigerator hum and thought for the first time maybe I wasn't busy. Maybe I was alone, and I had been for longer than I knew. Tomorrow, I told myself, I'd get out more. I didn't know how hard that would be. The next morning, I tried to prove myself wrong. I put on my good coat, the one that still smelled faintly like cedar from the closet, and drove to the community center where they hosted a weekly coffee hour. I had seen the flyer on the bulletin board at the library and torn off the little tab with the phone number, as if commitment could be reduced to a strip of paper. In the parking lot, I sat with the engine running, watching people move from their cars to the door in small groups that seemed to already know where to stand. Inside, the room had folding chairs and the kind of bright overhead lights that make everyone look a little tired. I poured coffee that tasted like it had been waiting longer than I had, and stood near a table of cookies, pretending to read the announcements posted on the wall. A man with a baseball cap nodded at me. I nodded back, grateful for something that counted as contact, but my feet stayed rooted. I didn't cross the room. I didn't introduce myself. I watched my own hesitation like it belonged to a stranger. I stood there long enough to notice how people greeted each other with first names and light jokes, as if they'd been practicing belonging for years. I told myself I could learn it by watching. I told myself I was being respectful, not interrupting. That was my old habit. Stay just outside the circle, be pleasant, take up as little space as possible. Years ago, I believed people would come to you if they wanted you, and if they didn't, you shouldn't force it. I understand now that belief came from fear, dressed up as manners. It was easier to call it humility than to admit I was afraid of being unwanted. A woman with silver hair and a thick scarf asked if the chair next to me was taken. I said, "No, please." And she sat, unwrapping a hard candy. She talked about her grandson's school play, about how she never understood the plot of those musicals but liked the costumes. I laughed in the right places, the way you do when you're trying to be normal. When she paused, I didn't offer anything back, not my name, not my own story, not even the small detail that I used to build sets for my daughter's plays when she was little. I let the moment pass and then watched it slide away for good. I drove home embarrassed, not because anyone had been unkind, but because I had been so careful I'd given nobody a chance. In the driveway, I sat with my hands on the wheel, feeling foolish and stubborn at the same time. Loneliness wasn't only about being alone, it was about being unreachable, even when you were standing in the same room as other people. That afternoon, I opened my phone contacts and stared at a name I hadn't pressed in months. My thumb hovered, and the screen felt heavier than it should have. Her name was Marlene, my sister-in-law, the one who always remembered birthdays even when the rest of us forgot. I hadn't called because it felt like borrowing, like asking for something I hadn't earned. Grief does that to you. It turns every request into a test. But that afternoon, with the winter light already draining out of the sky, I pressed her number before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring, breathless, as if she'd been moving when the phone started. "Hello?" she said, and when I spoke my own name, there was a small pause that hurt more than I expected. Then her voice softened. "Oh, honey," she said, the way my wife used to say it when she found me alone in the garage, pretending to fix something that wasn't broken. "How are you doing?" I wanted to say, "Fine." The word rose up like it always did. Instead, I stared at the kitchen window, at the bare branches scraping the glass, and I said, "I don't know." My throat tightened, and suddenly the room I'd been cleaning and managing felt unfamiliar, like I'd been living in a place that didn't quite belong to me. Marlene didn't rush to fill the silence. She waited. That waiting was a kind of hand on my shoulder. I told her about the grocery store, the soup aisle, the coffee hour where I stood like a lamp. I didn't make it dramatic. I didn't even cry. I just spoke in plain sentences, and I could hear my own life again. She said she'd worried about me, that she didn't want to intrude, that she figured I needed time. I believed then that time was something you could take privately and still return to people later, unchanged. I understand now that time is not neutral. If you spend it alone long enough, it teaches you a language that other people don't speak. Marlene asked if I wanted to come for Sunday dinner. The invitation was simple, nothing ceremonial. My first instinct was to refuse, to protect her from my awkwardness, to protect myself from the feeling of arriving empty-handed. Then I realized how many times I'd used politeness as a shield. I said yes, and the word felt like stepping off a curb you didn't see. On Sunday, I drove across town with a store-bought pie sweating in its plastic shell on the passenger seat. At her house, the porch light glowed warm against the dusk. When she opened the door, I smelled onions and rosemary and something baking, and my body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders dropped. Inside, her grandkids ran past me like bright birds, and nobody stopped to ask if I was okay. They just assumed I belonged there. At the table, Marlene's son asked about my old job, and I surprised myself by telling a story. Not a speech, not a lesson, just a memory. Driving home later, the loneliness was still there, but it had shifted. It wasn't a sealed room anymore. It was a door that could open if I was willing to push. The next week, I tried to push again, not with grand plans, just with small, repeatable moves. I wrote, "Call someone" on a sticky note and put it by the kettle so I'd see it when the water boiled. The note wasn't a rule, it was a reminder that a day could slip away without a single real exchange if I let it. On Monday, I called my cousin Ray, the one I used to fish with before we both got older, and started saying someday like it was a calendar date. Ray answered with cautious cheer, like he wasn't sure whether the call meant good news or bad. We talked about weather and back pain, the usual safe subjects. Then there was a pause, and I heard the television in his background, the same kind of noise I kept running in my own house. Without thinking too hard, I said, you ever get the feeling the days are too quiet? There it was, the truth tossed out like a hook in the water. Ray exhaled and said, "Yeah, more than I like to admit." The relief in his voice startled me. I had pictured my loneliness as a private flaw, something embarrassing. In that moment, I understood it was more common than people confessed. We talked longer after that, not in a dramatic way, but with a steadiness that felt honest. He told me he ate dinner in front of the sink because the table felt like an accusation. I told him I did the same thing. We laughed, but it wasn't a joke. It was recognition. 2 days later, I went back to the community center. The same harsh lights, the same coffee that tasted like patience. This time, I didn't hover by the wall. I picked a chair and sat down, even though sitting felt like declaring something. The man in the baseball cap was there again. I told him my name. He told me his, Leonard, and we talked about the snow and the potholes and the way the city never fixed anything until spring. Ordinary words, but they landed like stones building a path. When the silver-haired woman sat near me, I said, "I'm glad you're here." She smiled, surprised, and then asked what I did before I retired. I told her about building sets for plays and how sawdust always got into your hair no matter what. She laughed, and I watched her face soften like she had made room for me without even realizing it. Driving home, I wasn't suddenly cured of anything. I still turned on the television out of habit, but I noticed the habit now. I could see the places where I'd been erasing myself. The loneliness didn't vanish. It became something I could name, and naming it made it less powerful. That weekend, I found an old photo of my daughter in a shoebox, and I realized I hadn't called her in weeks. I stared at her smile and felt the old fear rise again. What if I've waited too long? My daughter, Elise, lived 2 states away, close enough that people said, "You should visit," and far enough that visiting always required planning, money, and the kind of courage you pretend you don't need. We talked on holidays and birthdays, and sometimes she sent pictures of her garden or her dog. I told myself that was normal, that adult children had their own lives. But as I held that photo, I remembered how she used to run into the house after school, calling my name like it was a place she could land. I dialed her number and listened to the ringing stretch. She answered with the sound of wind behind her. "Dad?" she said, and I could hear she'd stepped away from something. Maybe a store, maybe a walk, maybe a busy day she didn't want to stop. I almost apologized for calling. Instead, I said, "I was looking at an old picture of you." It was a small truth, but it opened the door. I described the photo. Her missing front tooth, the oversized sweatshirt, the proud way she held up a cardboard castle I'd helped her build for school. Elise laughed, and the laugh carried something that sounded like relief. She told me she'd been meaning to call but didn't want to bother me. I told her I'd been meaning to call but didn't want to seem needy. We both went quiet at the same time, the way people do when they realize they've been cooperating in a misunderstanding. I believed then that being a good parent meant not leaning on your child, even when you were older. I understand now that avoiding your child can feel like rejection to them, even if you call it independence. Elise said gently, "Dad, I worry about you." My first instinct was to reassure her, to say the word fine. Instead, I told her the truth I'd been practicing. I've been lonelier than I realized. She didn't gasp or lecture. She simply said, "Okay, thank you for telling me." Then she asked if I'd eaten, if I'd been out lately, if I was seeing anyone. The questions were ordinary, but they were also a way of holding me steady. I told her about Sunday dinner at Marlene's, about the coffee hour, about Leonard and the potholes. Elise listened like these details mattered, and I felt something unclench. We talked for nearly an hour. Before we hung up, she said, "Can we do a video call on Wednesdays? Just for a few minutes? I'm usually home." The offer was simple, but it carried a promise. Repeatable, reliable, not dependent on sudden bursts of motivation. I said yes, and the yes felt like stepping into air and finding a floor. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and let myself feel what I'd been avoiding. Loneliness wasn't only missing people, it was the way I had trained myself to act as if I didn't need to be missed. The next day, I drove to the hardware store and bought a cheap set of shelves because I decided to clear out the spare room. Not to renovate, not to be productive, but to make space. I didn't know for what yet, but I could sense something coming. Clearing the spare room felt like opening a window in a house that had been shut too long. It had become a storage place for grief. Extra blankets, boxes of papers I couldn't face, old tools I didn't use but couldn't throw away. I worked slowly, stopping often, not because my back hurt, though it did, but because each object carried a memory that wanted to be handled carefully. I found one of my wife's scarves, light as a breath, and for a moment I pressed it to my face and let the ache come and go like weather. Under a stack of folders, I found a small notebook with my handwriting, a list of phone numbers from years ago. Names I hadn't thought of in a long time. One of them was Tom, a neighbor from our first house, the man who taught me how to fix a leaky faucet and helped me load a couch into a truck without complaining. We lost touch when we moved, casually, without saying goodbye. I stared at his name, and the loneliness I'd been naming lately suddenly had a direction, not just outward, but backward. I searched for Tom and found a landline listed under his name in a town about 40 minutes away. When he picked up, his voice was deeper and rougher, and he sounded wary. I said my name, and there was a long silence. Then he laughed, a short burst that turned into a cough. "Well, I'll be," he said. "I thought you'd fallen off the earth." We talked about the old neighborhood, about the tree we planted in our front yard, about kids riding bikes in the street. Then he asked, "Careful, how's your wife?" The question landed hard. I told him she was gone, and the quiet on the line turned respectful. Tom said he was sorry, and I believed him. He didn't rush me. He didn't try to fix the moment. He just stayed there with me in the truth. Tom told me he met friends every Saturday morning at a diner for coffee and eggs, the same group for years. "You should come," he said, as if it was obvious. My stomach tightened. The old fear returned, the fear of walking into a room where everyone already knows where to sit. But I heard myself say, "Yeah, I'd like that." Saturday came and I drove to the diner early, hands sweating on the wheel like I was 19 again. Inside, the smell of bacon filled the air. Tom waved me over to a booth where 3 other men sat, older, worn in their ways. Introductions happened quickly. The conversation moved around me at first, then pulled me in without forcing it. When someone joked about the price of eggs, I laughed and felt the sound vibrate in my chest. When I left, Tom clapped my shoulder and said, "Next week?" I said, "Yes," and the yes felt like a thread tying one day to the next. Driving home, I realized I'd spent years treating connection like something you either had or didn't. Now it looked more like something you practiced. That thought followed me into my driveway where the house waited, quieter than the diner, but not as threatening as it used to be. Once I started paying attention, I could see my life like a map with missing roads. I had always been dependable. I showed up for work, paid bills on time, kept my promises, but I avoided the kind of closeness that required me to be known, because being known meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability felt like a doorway to disappointment. That belief started long before old age and widowhood. It had simply become easier to notice now that the house was quiet enough to hear my own thoughts. On a Wednesday evening after my video call with Elise, I stood in the spare room surrounded by half-sorted boxes and the new shelves leaning against the wall. We'd talked about nothing important, just her seedlings and a neighbor's dog that wouldn't stop barking. When the call ended, I felt steadier. I remembered a moment from years ago when my wife asked gently why I never invited people over. She said the house was fine, that nobody cared about the clutter or the chipped paint. I told her I didn't want to impose, that people were busy, that we'd see them when we saw them. The truth was, I liked having control over my environment. I liked knowing I could retreat. I believed then that keeping distance kept peace. I understand now that distance also keeps love from having somewhere to land. A few days later, Marlene mentioned almost casually, "You should have people over. Not for anything fancy, just coffee." The old panic rose in me. My house wasn't ready. My grief wasn't tidy. I could feel excuses lining up like soldiers. Then I remembered that soup aisle, how I'd wanted to speak and didn't. I told Marlene, "Okay, next week, just coffee." Saying it out loud made it real. That week, I cleaned, but not the frantic cleaning of someone preparing for inspection. I cleared space on the couch. I wiped the counters. I put out mugs and a small plate, planning as if people would actually come. The morning of the visit, I baked cornbread from a mix, and the smell filled the house in a way that made it feel lived in again. Marlene arrived first, then Ray, then Leonard. For a moment, I watched them take off their coats in my hallway like it was a scene from someone else's life. They sat, they talked, they laughed, and the house held the sound without breaking. I didn't perform. I didn't hide. I poured coffee, listened, and spoke when it was my turn. When Leonard mentioned the potholes again, Ray told a story that made us all laugh, and I felt gratitude that didn't need words. After they left, I stood in the kitchen and noticed something strange. The quiet didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like a pause between visits. I went to bed with the ache of missing my wife still present, but not swallowing the room. I could see the difference now between grief and loneliness. Grief was love with nowhere to go. Loneliness was me refusing to let love go anywhere new. The next morning, I circled Saturday on the calendar for the diner, and I realized I was starting to believe in my own future again, one small appointment at a time. Spring arrived slowly, the way it does when winter has been stubborn. The snow shrank into gray piles in parking lots, and the air smelled like wet dirt and thawing leaves. On a Saturday morning after the diner, I drove home with the windows cracked open. At a red light, I watched a young couple argue softly, then reach for each other's hands anyway. That gesture stayed with me. It wasn't romance, it was the refusal to disconnect. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw the porch light I'd left on all winter had burned out. I stood on the steps with a new bulb in my palm and smiled at myself because for months that light had been my symbol of safety. Leave it on. Keep the dark away. Keep the house ready for nobody in particular. I replaced the bulb, and as the glass warmed in my hand, I felt this thought. My life didn't need to be protected from other people. It needed to be open to them. The following Wednesday, Elise called early for our usual slot. She showed me her seedlings on the camera like they were treasures, and her kitchen looked ordinary and real behind her. I told her about the coffee at my house, about Leonard's jokes, about Tom and the diner. Elise said, "Dad, you sound lighter." I didn't feel light, I felt steadier. There's a difference, and I could hear it in my own voice. After we hung up, I walked through the rooms and noticed details I had stopped seeing. The indentation on the armchair where my wife used to sit, the scratch on the door frame from moving furniture years ago, the photograph on the mantel with all of us squinting into the sun. Those things used to stab me. Now they felt like proof that a life had happened here. I believed then that moving forward meant leaving things behind and keeping your head down. I understand now that moving forward can also mean carrying your past openly, letting it be part of the room without letting it be the only thing in the room. In late April, Leonard invited me to help with a volunteer project at the community center, assembling care packages. We worked with our hands, passing boxes and talking in pieces. And afterward, a few of us grabbed lunch. I told a story. People laughed, and I felt included without trying to be. Driving home, I realized I had stopped measuring my days by how much I got done and started measuring them by who I had heard from, who I had spoken to, who I could picture clearly in my mind. Loneliness still visited sometimes, especially in the blue light of evening, but it no longer felt like a verdict. One night, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at my calendar. Wednesday calls, Saturday diner, another coffee date penciled in. I thought back to that winter day in the soup aisle. The moment my mouth opened and I said nothing, I could finally admit what I hadn't known then. I had been lonely in a quiet, respectable way, the kind you can hide inside routine. Seeing it now didn't shame me. It steadied me, and it made the next choice clearer.